Continuing my series on World War II tanks that need adding to War Thunder, we now come to Swedish World War II tanks. And while we do have the vast majority of Swedish vehicles from this period already in game, there are still a few major tank variants, armoured cars, and at least one sorely needed anti-air vehicle that still need adding. So we'll start off by looking at the Swedish tanks, or more specifically in this case, one of the prototypes for the Strv M38. Namely tank number 62. So the Stridsvagn M38 was a variant of the Landsverk company's L60 design. Of course, we looked at the Landsverk company quite extensively when looking at Swedish interwar tanks, and many nations like Ireland and Hungary had bought this vehicle, while other nations like Switzerland, Poland and Austria would test it though wouldn't go ahead and actually buy it. But in mid-1936, the Swedish military would show interest in this tank, which resulted in two prototypes being ordered as the L60S. The first prototype, tank number 61, would initially only be built as a chassis, but the second, labelled tank number 62, would be a fully complete tank, and would differ significantly from the variant that would ultimately be adopted by the Swedish Army. For example, the turret was taken from the Pvkv M39 armoured car, and the main armament would consist not of the 37mm Bofors gun, but instead a 20mm Madsen autocannon. Now, the Swedish military didn't want the 20mm gun for a variety of reasons, instead preferring the 37mm gun, with one of these being that the Madsen was built in Denmark. So if Denmark was invaded or turned against Sweden, Sweden would suddenly find itself cut off from acquiring new guns for its tanks. In real life and in game, the 20mm would also be a downgrade when compared to the 37mm gun, as it had a worse penetration, managing just 25mm at 175 metres, versus 55mm at 100 metres for the 37mm gun, though this is somewhat offset by the faster firing rate, which will be handy in some situations and might make it a better choice against less armoured enemies where sheer weight of fire might be the deciding factor in knocking them out. The mantlet and frontal hull are also different, with the mantlet not being one piece like on the later M38 design, while the machine gun now could be independently aimed, though I can't see this making much of a difference in game. Meanwhile, at the hull front you can see two square vents or hatches are installed adjacent to the tracks, while the U-shaped area where the headlight and vented cover is installed on the adopted M38 design has been moved downwards on the hull, and has now been given a solid cover rather than the later vented one. The frontal hull plate has also been given an extra step, which has been sloped to a greater degree, which will provide a little bit of extra protection for the tank, though with the armour being so thin I can't see it being practically useful in most combat situations, though it might help against some glancing hits from smaller caliber weapons or longer ranged shells. The engine was also changed from the original design like that used on the Irish L60s, as the original German 155 horsepower Busing NAG L8VG engine was instead replaced by a Swedish 142 horsepower Scania Vabis Type 1664 engine. So the top speed should still be around 28 miles per hour or 45 kilometers an hour, so it does seem to have a very similar performance to the German engine, though it was a little larger and was changed primarily so that Sweden would still be able to produce tank engines domestically in the event of German-built engines becoming unavailable, presumably due to war, while the crew count should still be 3, with a driver in the hull and the gunner and commander in the turret. In-game, I could see this making for a good alternative to the Stridsvagn M38 at 1.0, perhaps even being folded with that vehicle, with the number 62 prototype having the advantage of a faster firing weapon, while the M38 would have a much harder hitting weapon overall, and while not a game-changing tank, it would still be nice to see it added in-game. In real life, the L60 would be adopted into Swedish service as the Stridsvagn M38, but with changes that brought it up to the standard that it is in-game, with the 37mm gun and single-piece mantlet, with 15 of this variant being ordered, while the first prototype, number 61, was also converted to the M38 standard. As for tank number 62, it would be used for various experiments before being converted into an SPG, while its use of independently aimed coaxial machine guns would make a comeback on later Swedish tank designs. So Sweden would adopt the Strv M38 and would steadily upgrade it, leading to the M39 and M40L that we have in game, with these making up the majority of Sweden's tank force in the early part of World War II. But there would be another variant, the Stridsvagn M40K, with the K standing for Karlstads Mekaniska Verkstad, who built 80 of this variant, Landsverk having built the previous M40L. Now, one of the areas that was upgraded was the armour, but in a few areas this might be a bit of a mixed bag. So the side armour has been given a very good upgrade, maxing out at 20mm for the turret and 18mm for the hull, compared to 13mm for the 40L, making the flanks much better protected against heavy machine gun fire or glancing hits from larger weapons, which is a good improvement. The frontal hull armour now also maxes out at 30mm for the lower hull front plate, which is better than the 13mm of the M40L, but the upper hull front plate maxes out at 36mm, which is actually less than the 43mm of the M40L, making this area more vulnerable. The reason for this change in area here is that the M40L only had 13mm of actual armour as standard on the tank, with 30mm applique armour instead being installed to increase this protection, which was useful in that it could be removed in peacetime in order to reduce weight and thus improve reliability, but using two plates for protection actually provides less protection in real life than a single plate, so the reduction in armour thickness would have been less of an issue in real life for the M40K, but unfortunately in game having one or two armour plates doesn't appear to make any real difference in protection, so this would be a straight up downgrade in protection for the upper hull plate. The engine has also been improved, now being a 162 horsepower Scania Vabis L603, which also required the hull to be slightly lengthened in order to fit the new engine, but unfortunately despite being more powerful, this is mostly offset by the increase in weight from the extra armour, and with the new engine and suspension only maintains the same top speed of the 40L, so 28 miles per hour or 45 kilometers an hour, while also carrying the same 3 crew members. In-game, I could see this being added at 2.0, maybe 2.3, either in a folder with the 40L or in between it and the Lago I. Honestly, this tank would be a bit of a mixed bag, with better protection in some areas, but less in a rather large area of the hull. But it could still throw off some enemies expecting it to have weaker side or superstructure armour like on the 40L, and while not a groundbreaking tank, it would be nice to see the last of the L60s used by Sweden represented in-game. In real life, the Stridsvagn M40K was produced from 1943 to 1944, with 80 being produced before production was halted. Ultimately, Sweden would never be invaded during World War II, so none of these L60 variants would see combat in Sweden, but they would be kept in service for a rather long time, with the last M40K retired in 1960, long after its obsolescence. However, 20 of the M40Ls would be sold to the Dominican Republic, with some of these being seized by rebel forces in the Dominican Civil War in 1965, and some of these would subsequently be destroyed when they attempted to attack intervening American forces equipped with M60 Patterns, M50 tank destroyers, and other modern anti-tank weapons, which went as well as you might expect for these ancient tanks. However, the remaining 12 would be refurbished at the end of the conflict, and these served until 2002, making the L60 one of the longest serving tank types in the world. Of course, despite building the L60 up until 1944, it had been recognised that it and the similarly armed Stridsvagn M41 would be no match for newer tanks, and that a new, more capable tank would be needed and would again need to be produced domestically. Luckily, the Landsverk company had been working on a 15-ton medium tank design intended for export, the Lago I. Now, you might recall this tank is already in-game at 2.7 with a 37mm gun, but quite a few sources I've looked at state that it was armed with a 47mm gun, including a literal advertising poster from Landsverk. Now, I suspect that maybe this was an intended future development, as the only Swedish 47mm guns I could find were old naval guns that I doubt would be fitted to a tank, or maybe it was an indication of what other nations could fit in the tank if they decided to buy it. Fortunately for Landsverk, the Hungarians, who were already producing the Swedish L60 light tank and L62 Anti Air vehicle, now showed interest in buying the Lago to use as their medium tank. This resulted in a redesign, with the main armament now being a 40mm Hungarian gun, which in-game has a penetration of 61mm at 500 metres with its APHE shell, versus 51mm for the 37mm gun on the in-game Lago I, while a 12.7mm machine gun was also fitted to the hull, making it useful for against lightly armoured enemies, though the weight of the tank had now increased to 18.3 tonnes. The rest of the stats should be broadly the same, with about the same 34mm maximum armour, top speed of 28 mph or 45 km/h from twin engines and an electromagnetic transmission, which we will talk about later, and a 5-man crew, 2 in the hull and 3 in the turret. Now in theory this gives us 2 possible variants that could be added, the 47mm variant and the 40mm variant. But again, I should caveat that it's possible the 47mm variant was more of an intended variant, with the 37mm gun perhaps being a stopgap that was never replaced due to changing requirements, but the 40mm variant did exist at least. As for their place in the game, I suspect they could both be added at around 2.3 to 2.7, as the Hungarian variant would at least have a very decent APHE shell, though of course the 37mm gun has the Sabo round with 95mm penetration at 500 metres, but I think these Lago variants would still be very useful in game, and it would be nice to see at least one of them added to War Thunder. In real life the Lago would be converted to Hungarian specifications by May 1941, but by now the Hungarians had decided to adopt the Czechoslovakian Skoda T21, which would become the Turan 1, which was a bit of a blow for the design. However, as luck would have it, as the Hungarians were walking away from the Lago, Sweden was looking for a new 22-ton medium tank, preferably domestically built and able to be put into production as quickly as possible. Thus, when Landsverk was approached to produce this new medium tank, it was decided to base it on the Lago I. Though of course the tank design would be heavier at 22 tonnes, the chassis would be lengthened, though not widened due to traffic regulations limiting the design to 2.35 metres wide, which does often give Swedish tanks a bit of an odd look, and it was also given a new turret and length 31 75mm gun, with this new design becoming the Strv M42. Now technically the M42 is already in game as the Stridsvagn M42EH, but this is just one of 4 variants of the M42, with the main difference between the variants being in the engine and transmission used. The first of these variants, the Strv M42TM and M42TH, were very similar to the in-game variant, but used 2 Scania Vabis 6031 engines, with each engine producing 162 horsepower for 324 horsepower total. But the twin engines, while providing a good amount of power, were also a problem as there wasn't a gearbox available domestically that could handle the 2-engine arrangement. And while the Atlas Diesel Company did start developing a hydraulic gearbox, it would take time to develop. However, as we mentioned earlier, the Lago prototype had also used 2 engines, and an electromagnetic gearbox from the German Zahnradfabrik Friedrichshafen company had been used. With no other choice if they were to get the tank into production as soon as possible, it was decided that the first 100 M42s built by Landsverk would be fitted with this electromagnetic transmission, becoming the M42TM, T standing for 2 engines and M for electromagnetic gearbox, while Landsverk would build a further 70 with hydraulic transmissions as the M42TH, again T for 2 engines while H is for hydraulic transmission. Now the electromagnetic transmission was quite good with regards to pure performance, having 6 gears forward and 1 reverse, giving more power to the drive wheel compared to the hydraulic transmission, which has 4 forward gears and 1 reverse. So the extra power will be useful in game, although the top speed for both variants is still 26 mph or 42 km/h, and the power to weight ratio is slightly worse at 14.4 tonnes versus 16.8 for the M42EH, though that variant in game has an even higher ratio of 18.2 horsepower a tonne when fully upgraded. The rest of the stats should be broadly the same as the M42EH, with the same crew, armament and armour, and possibly just some very minor differences in weight. In-game, I could see the M42TM being added at 2.7 as an event or premium vehicle, being very similar to the M42EH, while the M42TH could be the start of a folder with the M42EH, being slightly worse in mobility and giving a reason to unlock the later variant, and it would still be nice for these often forgotten variants of the M42 to be added in-game. So you might be thinking with the M42TM, the Swedes had a pretty good tank on their hands all things considered, using state-of-the-art technology to ensure better mobility, while also having the TH variant with its domestically produced gearbox as a backup if they were cut off from their German supply of gearboxes. However, real life isn't so simple, and in hindsight, buying a new experimental gearbox from a nation that was currently being heavily bombed, was low on certain resources and raw materials, had a need to prioritise production for its own armed forces, and was literally using slave labour to help meet this demand, was probably not the best idea in the world. These factors probably explain the large number of problems with the gearbox, as while in pure power the electromagnetic transmission was superior to the hydraulic version, the reliability of the gearbox was absolutely awful, failing after even short distances and requiring constant repairs, with the problem being so bad that by October 1944, only a year after production had begun, 51 of 89 M42 TMs with the 3rd Armoured Regiment were deemed unserviceable, and this was in peacetime. Of course, the M42TH with its hydraulic transmission was still around, and Volvo was now asked to produce a number of these tanks, with 125 being built in total, but they had to be heavily pressured into building them as they were using engines from the Scania Vabis company, who were a competitor to Volvo. Eventually, a compromise was made where Volvo would produce the M42s with the Scania Vabis engine, but would also design a single larger engine that would be used in the M42EH variant that we have in game, which was a more powerful engine but suffered in regard to reliability as well, though to a much lesser degree. Of course, being the variant we have in game, you would think this was built in large numbers, but only 57 were built, less than the other two variants. Naturally, having 3 variants of their medium tank, all with different engines and gearboxes, and with one of them barely working at all, was not exactly a wonderful situation to be in logistically, and one wonders how things might have been in the event of having to fight a war with them. Once World War II was over and Sweden was under less pressure, it was decided to convert the entirety of the M42 TM fleet, with 30 being fitted with hydraulic transmissions to become M42 THs, while the remaining 70 were to be fitted with a new mechanical transmission, becoming the M42 TV, aka T for 2 engines and V for Volvo gearbox, and also making the in-game EH variant literally the least produced variant of this tank. This variant of the M42 now had a gearbox with 5 forward gears and 1 reverse, and a slightly faster top speed of 28 mph or 45 km/h, while the rest of its stats are again the same as the M42EH. In-game, I could see this being added at the end of a folder with the other M42 variants, or again as an event or premium tank, as this would play much the same as the M42EH, but with a slightly better top speed that might allow it to get around the map a little bit easier, and it would be nice to see this ultimate version of the M42 in-game. In real life, with 3 variants of this tank in service, the Stridsvagn M42 would soldier on into the 1950s, before being replaced by the Stridsvagn 81, aka the British Centurion. However, this wouldn't be the end of these tanks, as the twin-engine variants would be converted into the odd-looking Strv 74, and in this guise would continue to see service until 1984, nearly 4 decades after its introduction, while the single-engine tanks would be converted into the Infantry Kanonvagn 73 or IKV 73 infantry support vehicles, with one of these being tested with a mechanical gearbox that could maybe be added as a unique tank if needed, and these tanks would serve until the 1970s, again a very long service life for these tanks. So moving on from the Swedish tanks, we can now look at the various Swedish tank destroyers and assault guns. And while most of these have been added, there are still a few that we could have, as you may recall that one of the L60S prototypes was converted into an experimental SPG, which necessitated replacing the turret with an open-topped fighting compartment, and it was given a new main armament. Originally, it was fitted with the 75mm Can M02, which is already fitted to the SAV M43 1944 in-game, and has a penetration of 58mm at 500 metres with its APBC shell, or 43mm with its APHE shell, which isn't too bad of a performance, and it would later be refitted with another 75mm gun, the 75mm Can M40, which seems to be able to fire the same shells as the Can M02, but with a slightly higher muzzle velocity of 525 metres a second versus 496 metres a second. So in theory it should perform a little bit better than that weapon, though if it wasn't given AP shells it would be stuck with a HE shell with just 9mm penetration, which would be almost unplayable, so it would have to be given those shells to be added to the game. Finally, it was redesignated the Stormpjäs FM43, and a 150mm recoilless rifle was fitted, which in-game fires a HE shell at 285 meters a second and has 48mm of penetration, which is a pretty good performance. As for the rest of the vehicle, its speed should remain broadly the same at 28 mph or 45 km/h, and would likely have a crew of 4. While the armour for the fighting compartment is only good enough to protect against small arms fire and shell splinters, while of course the open-topped nature of the fighting compartment does make the whole vehicle vulnerable to enemy aircraft. In-game I would suggest adding the 75mm variants before the IKV-72 at 1.0 to 1.3, as they have worse performing 75mm guns, a slower top speed and a larger silhouette, making them perform worse than the IKV-72, though not drastically so. Meanwhile, the Stormpjäs FM43 could be added at 1.7, either as a premium or event tank, or in a folder with the FM43-44, which has the same weapon but also has a whole machine gun, and I could see these tanks performing much the same, but it would still be nice to have this vehicle in War Thunder. In real life, the attempts to mount the 75mm guns and 150mm recoilless rifle would see some success, but the projects would be moved onto the more capable Strv M41 chassis, leading to better Swedish SPGs in the future. There is also the prototype of the Pvkv M43, which looks rather odd from the front and is armed with the 75mm LV-Can M30 in a ball mount, which is less powerful than the Pvkv M43 that the production version would be fitted with, but it could still make for a cool, rare vehicle to add in the Swedish tech tree, probably at 3.3 to 3.7, and it would be an interesting vehicle to have in game. So moving on from Swedish tanks, we can now look at Swedish armoured cars, with of course the most famous Swedish armoured car being the Landsverk L-180, which I covered in detail on my episode looking at Swedish interwar tanks. But as a quick recap, this was armed with a 20mm M40 autocannon with 30mm penetration at 500 meters, as well as 2 machine guns, maximum armour of 15mm, 5 crew including a rear driver, and the top speed was 46 mph or 75 km/h, which would all in all make it a very decent low-tier armoured car for Sweden. Another less famous Swedish armoured car that we could get is the Panzerbil M39, also sometimes referred to as the Lynx, which was an armoured car design produced by Landsverk. Now you might be thinking, hang on, isn't this armoured car already in game? And this is sort of the case, as we have the Panzerbil M40, which was a later variant of this armoured car that was ordered for the Swedish army and produced by Volvo. The Panzerbil M39 on the other hand was produced by Landsverk for the Danish army, with 18 being ordered in total, but only 3 of these made it into Danish hands before the German invasion, so the remaining 15 were taken over by the Swedes. Now the M39 is a very similar design to the M40, with the main difference being that it uses a 135 horsepower Scania Vabis engine as opposed to the 142 horsepower Volvo engine, while the first 9 of these armoured cars also had a different style turret and 4 machine guns, while the other M39s were mostly the same as the M40, having the same top speed of 43 mph or 70 km/h, while having the same 20mm Bofors autocannon as the M40, as well as 3 machine guns, 13mm of armour and a crew of 6. The Pbil M39 could be added to War Thunder at 1.0 in the light tank line, and it would be a good way of giving players access to the Lynx armoured car without having to buy the Pbil M40 on the marketplace, letting players have access to a decently armed vehicle with good mobility, and overall it would just be very nice to have it in War Thunder. In real life, the Pbil M39 would prove to be a very successful vehicle, with a further 30 being ordered from Volvo as the Pbil M40, and they would be kept in service until 1958, with 13 of these being sold to the Dominican Republic, and some of these stayed in service until the 1990s, again giving a very long life of service, which does seem to be a bit of a theme with the Swedish vehicle so far. Of course, with the war raging, there was always demand for newer and better vehicles to equip Sweden's armed forces, with these usually being produced domestically by Swedish companies. However, occasionally Sweden would acquire vehicles from abroad, which brings us to the Pvkv M31F, which is actually a Soviet BA-10 armoured car. Now, the history of these vehicles is interesting because despite being a Soviet vehicle, they were actually acquired from Finland, who had managed to capture a number of these armoured cars and subsequently sold 3 of them to Sweden. However, while the BA-10 originally had a top speed of 33 miles per hour or 53 kilometers an hour, when they were sold to Sweden, the Finns had removed the engine, transmission and even tyres, so Swedish alternatives were installed, likely giving different mobility stats compared to the Soviet version. While the 37mm gun from the Strv M41 was installed as well, which gives it a worse performance in armour penetration, not counting the early tier Swedish Sabo shell. Lastly, the armour maxes out at 15mm, with some sloping to maximise its protection and a crew of 4 to operate the vehicle. This would be a rather interesting armoured car to have in War Thunder, probably at 1.0 to 1.3. Not being as fast as the Lynx, but having a better armament to compensate, and it would be nice for this rather unusual armoured car to be added to the Swedish tech tree. In real life, only 3 vehicles were brought by Sweden in 1942, and possibly it was intended to be a bit of a secret, which would explain why they were given a designation indicating they were from 1931. But they would ultimately serve until 1952, before being withdrawn from service, and unfortunately none of these vehicles survive today. Lastly, for armoured cars, we have the Pvkv M37, or Pvkv Skaro Panzer, my apologies if I've mispronounced that, which was an improvised armoured car that was based on a Ford truck on the Swedish island of Gotland in 1937, where there were no armoured vehicles present at the time. The armour itself was very light, being made up of 6.2mm infantry shields that had been in storage since World War I, which were good enough for against small arms fire and splinter damage, but not against any dedicated anti-tank weapons, which isn't helped by the open-topped nature of the fighting compartment, which makes the vehicle highly vulnerable to enemy aircraft. That said, it does come with a decent armament, which was originally a twin 8mm machine gun, but was later upgraded to the 20mm M40 autocannon, which as mentioned earlier can penetrate 30mm at 500 metres, making this deadly against both ground and aerial targets, though its 36 round magazine could cause some issues, especially if the amount of ammo carried is limited. I haven't found an exact model of Ford truck used, but it was said to have a V8 engine, and I can't see it having a top speed of over 40 miles per hour or 64 kilometers an hour, and it could well be slower, especially when driving off-road, which could cause some issues, while the crew would likely be 4 to 5, likely a driver and commander in the front, and 2 to 3 crew manning the gun. The M37 could probably be added at 1.0, and could work well against enemy tanks and aircraft while having a decent on-road speed, but would be vulnerable to return fire on the ground and enemy aircraft especially, but it would still be nice for this cool vehicle to be added to War Thunder. In real life, the M37 would perform decently well, and in 1941 another vehicle would be constructed based on a Volvo truck, with both vehicles owning the nickname Gryljauk and Oscar. So last but certainly not least, we come to Swedish Anti Air vehicles, including one that I am astounded hasn't been added to War Thunder yet. But before we look at that vehicle, we will take a look at the Terrangbil M42, which is technically more of an armoured personnel carrier, but would likely function more as a starting anti-air vehicle, with 2 variants being made, one on a Volvo truck chassis and one on a Scania Vabis truck chassis. Its armament was somewhat limited at first, consisting of just one 8mm machine gun, but this was later upgraded to 2 8mm machine guns, which wouldn't be any good against ground targets, but would be suitable for use against early tier aircraft, which at 1.0 would often be fragile biplanes. I have also seen references to a 20mm autocannon being fitted as part of a test, which could be potentially added as well. When it comes to the rest of the stats, these are mostly the same across both variants, though one variant was fitted with a 105 horsepower Volvo engine and the other a 115 horsepower Scania Vabis engine. But even with the different engines, both variants have a top speed of 43 miles per hour or 70 kilometers an hour, 8 to 20mm of armour, though with an open-topped troop compartment and a crew of 3, though up to 16 troops could also be carried as well. In-game, I think this would be a very good 1.0 anti-air vehicle, as currently we have the Pvkv FM42, which while decently armed has the issue of carrying very limited ammunition, making it not very good for prolonged engagements, while the Terang Bill's reduced armament, while less effective against enemy aircraft, should still do okay against some of the lower tier planes, and it should have better ammunition reserves, while also giving players an anti-air vehicle at 1.0. In real life, the first M42s weren't delivered until 1944, and it wasn't until the 1950s that the twin machine guns were fitted, at which point they were redesignated TGB M42 VKPF and SKPF, depending on what chassis was used. And while they didn't see combat in World War II, some of the SKPF vehicles were used by Swedish UN troops in the Congo, while the VKPF were retained at home. Ultimately, the VKPF vehicles would be retired in the 1970s, but the SKPF vehicles would be upgraded in the 1980s, and some were donated to various Baltic nations who made their own upgrades, with these vehicles not being retired fully until 2004, again marking yet another long-lived Swedish vehicle. Lastly, for Swedish anti-air vehicles, we come to an SPAA I've been waiting for a very long time. You see, Sweden currently has a sizable gap between the L62 at 3.3 and the LVKV42 at 4.7, which brings us to the LVKV FM43, which I feel could easily fill this gap. So the LVKV FM43 is a Swedish anti-air vehicle that was designed by Landsverk and based on a lengthened M40K chassis, and was armed with two 40mm Bofors guns in a Bofors designed turret. Now, there are sometimes mixed opinions on these guns in the anti-air role, as they lack a HEVT shell and are not the fastest firing weapons compared to something like the Wirbelwind, but they do perform decently well in the hands of a skilled player and are more likely to achieve one-hit kills compared to smaller caliber weapons, as well as having a better chance of reaching longer distance enemies. Having two of these guns also alleviates some of the problems with a slower rate of fire, and the turret's turn speed of around 51 degrees a second will make reacting to aerial threats easier than on some slower turning turrets. The Bofors also does very well in the anti-armour role, having an in-game penetration of 58mm at 500m or 69mm at 100m, more than enough to penetrate the sides of most enemies, and even the front of some more lightly armoured tanks, making this a good dual-purpose weapon to have on the battlefield. Of course, armour is very light with a maximum thickness of just 15mm, and it has an open-topped fighting compartment, making it vulnerable to enemy aircraft. But the armour does mostly protect the crew from ground-based fire, and of course most anti-air vehicles only have light armour usually anyway, so this isn't a problem unique to this vehicle. And while looking rather tall, the FM43 is actually shorter than the M42 Duster and Wirbelwind, which aids in concealing yourself from enemies. Speed, however, is a bit of a problem, having a top speed of just 22 mph or 36 km/h from a 162 horsepower Scania Vabis L603/3 engine, making this slower than most other tracked anti-air vehicles in-game. But fortunately for us, there was an upgrade in the 1950s that replaced the Scania Vabis engine with a 290 horsepower Maybach HL120 TRM engine, not quite doubling the horsepower available, and giving a new top speed of 34 mph or 55 km/h, comparable to some of the faster SPAA vehicles at tiers 3 to 4. Lastly, the crew count was 4, which is less than on some other anti-air vehicles and making it vulnerable to crew losses. In-game, we could get the initial variant with the less powerful engine at 3.7, and the variant with the upgraded engine at 4.0, and I think these vehicles would be a very welcome addition to the Swedish tech tree, making a good upgrade from the L62 before unlocking the LVKV42, with its longer-barrelled 40mm Bofors, and it would be nice for these long-awaited anti-air vehicles to get their place in War Thunder. In real life, despite design work beginning in 1943, no prototype was ever made, so when 17 vehicles were ordered in March 1945, it went straight into production, with the first vehicles delivered in 1947 and quickly issues cropped up, especially around the lackluster engine and narrow tracks, while at any rate 17 vehicles was hardly enough for their intended role in the Swedish army. As mentioned, there were upgrades carried out, which involved replacing the engine, giving it wider tracks and other more minor modifications. But ultimately the vehicle itself was now obsolete in the jet age, and despite attempts at producing a replacement like the Lvkv-42, these never amounted to anything, and the Lvkv-43 was withdrawn from service in 1969. So that's it for this episode looking at Swedish tanks that need adding to War Thunder, and I'd like to see your thoughts on these vehicles and any others you'd like me to cover in the comments below. The next episode will likely be covering Chinese tanks, and we will actually have some unique Chinese vehicles to look at compared to their World War I and interwar episodes, so hopefully you're looking forward to that. Anyway, thanks for watching the video, hope you've enjoyed it. I've been Toreno and I'll see you next time.